While I was in Berlin, I made it a goal to tell the story of how gay men were treated in the Holocaust. Tens of thousands were sent to the camps, and their death rate was as high as 60%. The Nazis had their own office for locating these men on the same street as this flag, called the Reich Central Office for the Combating of Homosexuality and Abortion. After the war, the Allies oddly helped the scientist in charge of the surgical experiments to cure homosexuality escape to Argentina, where he advertised and practiced his medical quackery for many years. He was never pursued, and the suffering of those wearing the pink triangle was covered up, because the act of gay relationships stayed illegal for decades after in West Germany, and the prisoners were kept in the camps after the war was over. My goal here is to tell the story of some of the casualties from their last homes, at their stepping stones. I want to start these stories with that of Wilhelm Bolcher, nearly 70 at the time of his death. He was a true badass, a veteran of World War I who returned missing a leg. His wife and children had died while he was in the trenches, and when the Nazis started targeting gay men, he opened his apartment for them to meet. Under torture, someone named Wilhelm, so he was dragged to the main headquarters of the Gestapo. After over 3 days of torture, his heart simply gave out, but he never named a single soul, saving countless men from the camps. Richard Barnack was a famous cabaret dancer and homosexual on Friesenstrasse. Laws against same-sex relationships were already in place prior to Nazi rise to power, but not long before, Berlin was called the gay capital of Europe. This changed with the rise of Hitler. Basic laws that specified short jail sentences quickly escalated to death in 1941. Barnack, who was at the time in Sachsenhausen, was murdered by fellow inmates. At least in this prison, it seems the favored method of execution was by some sort of beating or organized prison riot. 32-year-old Barnack was killed in late March of 1942. He lived here in an area that is still a hotbed of anarchist and left-wing activism, as it was before the Nazi era. Adjacent to Tempelhof Airport, it was also an area which had many Jewish residents. This is the last home of Wilhelm Machthold, a complex figure to be sure. He considered himself a German patriot and fought in the trenches of the Great War, returning home to join the right-wing Free Corps. He was also a social progressive and a confident homosexual, joining a gay rights group in the 1920s. Eventually, his activities were uncovered by a detective, and he was shot as he tried to flee. At a Gestapo interrogation, they remarked, quote, closed with the remark that Machthold is an extremely stubborn and persistent liar who cannot be induced by any means to stand by his deeds and name his partners. We see here in this remark that they were essentially torturing him to name the people that he slept with. He managed to withhold most of them, but not all the names, and was eventually sentenced to Sachsenhausen as well, and beaten to death much like the other inmate in 1942. On Friedrichstrasse is the last home of Max Matschke, the son of the lord of a manor and a mother who worked as a maid. He served on the Western Front and became a police officer in Berlin afterwards. He was fired in 1923 because of his sexual orientation. He secretly met his first boyfriend, who died of an illness and left his costume shop, the Max, which was frequented by huge film stars of the day. His next boyfriend was sure to stay very discreet and distant, but they were outed by their neighbor, who contacted the police after finding a letter addressed, "Your loving Fritz." They were arrested and sentenced to several months, but later when the police came back and were set to send them away for longer, they found them in the kitchen of their shop, dead in each other's arms. The gas to the stove was on. Herbert Budislawski was another young revolutionary, only 23 when he was killed. In downtown Berlin, he lived until 1942, a well-known homosexual and a son of a liberal Jewish merchant family. As the Nazis rose to power, he expressed his communist sympathies to a local couple who put him in contact with the Herbert Baum resistance cell. In 1942, they attacked an anti-Soviet propaganda exhibit. The attack was successful, but the group was then exposed. Herbert was executed as a homosexual, and this was what got reported. But that wasn't the only part of his life. The rest of his life was devoted to hit-and-run anti-Nazi resistance at the heart of the Third Reich. I believe the Nazis also found papers in his home indicating that he wanted to run off to Spain to fight the fascists there as well. Manfred Lewin has one of the most well-known stories of this manner, partly because his lover Gad Beck survived. When Lewin's family was arrested and awaiting to be sent to the camps, Gad borrowed a neighbor's Hitler Youth uniform and marched to the pre-transportation facility. He convinced the guard to let him in, where he spoke with Lewin. The guard allowed them to leave the facility under the guise that Beck was bringing Lewin back to retrieve his papers. They rounded the corner and shared a moment, but Lewin said that he couldn't leave his family. They both knew what this meant, and Gad Beck said that they later parted without saying any goodbyes. That was the last time he ever saw his lover Manfred, and he said that that was the moment that he grew up. He was one of the few men who spoke about his experience after the war because in many cases, gay men were rearrested after the camps were liberated, using Nazi records and even Nazi judges. Some survivors testified that they were met in the same court by the same judges that sent them to the camps in the first place, who laughed and taunted them, saying even, quote, "We meet again." Gad Beck spoke openly, a voice for those intimidated into silence. Germany before the Nazis had become one of the most accepting places for gays in the world. Magazines were published for the movement and gay rights groups were created. It came as a surprise to many how quickly the SA targeted them with accusations and violence. The book burnings, which have been rewritten by many modern commentators with their own agendas, were not Bibles or history books, but the books of gay rights publications from the Institute of Sexual Science. The German government has still refused to acknowledge that this act was in fact illegal. I guess my point in making this video is to point out that the LGBT movement, or really any movements at all, must not let their guard down, ever. Even when you think you have it good and you have all the rights in the world, you're never more than 5 years away from prison, or worse.